In today's episode, we are dedicating the time to following up on the NATO summit and to discuss potential outcomes for Ukraine as well during its ongoing invasion by Russia. We want to find out what discussions potentially took place behind closed doors. What is the Western perspective on Ukrainian victory, and how are events on the ground going to influence the direction of the war and, of course, importantly, its aftermath? Will the clear moral stance of Western allies in supporting Ukraine during wartime descend into messy compromises in peacetime? Will there be ethical trade-offs with Russia? And we are already starting to see the narrative appear about peace at any price. Well, it'll be important to look at that in the context of NATO and what was discussed during the summit, and of course during the 75th anniversary events that recently took place. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like, subscribe, and definitely add comments to the videos, especially if you find the materials challenging and interesting. Please check out the validated Ukrainian charities that appear in the description of the video, and also do support the work we do by becoming a patron or buy me a coffee. Today's guest is Mark Temnycky, who is a Ukrainian-American freelance journalist and academic based outside of New York City, although I think you've recently moved, but we won't give you away your precise location. And he is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. He's covered Eastern European affairs and energy security matters for a number of years, with articles published in the New York Times, Forbes, Daily Mail, EU Observer, Kiev Post, Atlantic Council, and many, many others. He has also been cited and worked with European Parliament, NATO, Helsinki Commission, Iran Corporation, and again, many others. I could spend a lot more time listing those. But Mark, this is the second time on the channel. I'm delighted to welcome you back. And if people enjoy this, they should definitely check out our previous conversation. Welcome.
Thank you for having me again. It's funny, about this time last year, we talked about the NATO Summit as well. So thank you for the
It was on the
conversation and the
14th
opportunity.
of July last year. I
That's
checked the
right.
date. So pretty much the anniversary. And of course, just to recap for people who are watching this, there was a certain degree of disappointment after the last summit because the language and actions that followed it were not particularly specific. Often noble words will cover up a lack of cohesion and specific action and follow-up. In your view, was this summit any better than the one we saw last year?
I think yes, but there were still some missed opportunities, and Ukrainian officials are disappointed again with NATO and the things that were addressed. So this year, there were several outcomes. First of all, NATO announced that they will have a representative based in Kiev, Ukraine. And this is significant because now a member of NATO's staff will be working in Ukraine with Ukrainian officials consistently and maintaining dialogue as much as they can. Something else that they implemented is that they would introduce 40 billion euro of additional defense aid. However, prior to this summit, the Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg had hoped that this was going to become an annual assistance for Ukraine, and that they fell short. So this 40 billion euro, while it's welcomed and it's a contribution of all 32 members, it comes short after this year. So that was something that was missed. In addition, something that's powerful is NATO has now established a new office in Germany where they will be coordinating NATO logistics and assistance to Ukraine to try to limit burden on certain countries and encourage other NATO participants to encourage the members to give more. So it will somewhat become more of a balanced playing field. However, there are still three main issues. First of all, Ukraine did not receive a membership request to join the alliance. Second, many restrictions still exist on Western assistance to the Ukrainians, meaning that they are not allowed to attack Russian military targets within certain borders, as established by the countries that are giving the Ukrainians this assistance. And the third big issue is the skies are still open, meaning that the Russians can use projectiles and other aerial strikes on Ukraine, either through Belarusian territory or from Russia itself.
Well,
So these
let's
are
let
three
yeah.
large issues that have not been addressed still, which made Ukrainian officials disappointed.
Well, let's pick up on those in turn, but let's start with the restrictions that are placed, because these kind of restrictions um, have changed over time as the threats become more existential to Ukraine and the clamor to have them lifted. Some of them have been softened. So Ukraine can now strike on Russian territory at any point where there is a massing of forces or armor, whether it's north of Kharkiv or Sumy. But it's very reactive, isn't it? All the way, it's been very reactive. And actually, the two parties that potentially have really insisted on these restrictions most vociferously, of course, are Berlin and Washington. Washington, especially, as one of the biggest partners there. And ahead of the NATO summit, there is a degree of confusion, wasn't there? Because the incoming Labour government seemed to indicate that there were fewer restrictions on the use of UK weapons. I mean, one of the main restrictions, of course, is how far they can be fired. But that the range of Storm Shadow is beyond the 100 kilometers, which is nominally the distance set where they could be used within Russian territory. So that kind of it can cover the whole of Crimea. And it can cover the whole of the occupied territories. But if you're talking about Russian sovereign territory itself, ignoring the Russian constitution, which has made
Mhm.
certain areas constitutionally part of it, but no one recognizes that. Um, so theoretically, Storm Shadow can be used beyond the restricted area, and the UK government seemed to indicate that that would be okay. It then rolled that back during the course of the NATO summit. What's your view on that? What's going on here? And it created a sense of disunity for a period during the summit.
And I think confusion in some cases, right? Ukraine was minding its own business, trying to implement various anti-corruption reforms in both its military and its government, its judiciary, etc. Russia invaded back in 2014 initially and took over Crimea and eastern Ukraine. And then, of course, we know the full-scale invasion in 2022. And with Ukrainian citizens and some members of Ukrainian government I've spoken with, it feels like each step they have to prove themselves to Western individuals and leaders before they're allowed, unlocking additional assistance or uh, an ability to target the Russian facilities. Russia is attacking Ukraine. Russia is at war with Ukraine, and I think it's only right for the Ukrainians to be able to defend themselves rather than being held to these various constraints. There are numerous weapons factories in the Russian Federation where they are constructing weapons for their military. There, of course, are various Russian airfields within the Russian Federation. There's ammunition deposits where the Russians are using, and then of course they're transporting troops through either Russia or Belarus to get into Ukraine. And something that I do not understand is if this country is being attacked and invaded, why is this country not allowed to defend itself and target, areas like we discussed north of Sumy or north of Kharkiv, where they have these Russian areas and military areas to destroy? Because allowing the Russians to move around freely gives them an opportunity to re-strategize, to regroup, re-weaponize, etc. While the Ukrainians, as we discussed, it's more of a reaction to what are the Russians doing instead of trying to take an advantage of the situation.
So it's
Similarly,
politics, essentially. It's politics
yes,
as opposed to
precisely.
military strategy. I have had a couple of guests on recently. I have pointedly asked them whether these red lines and restrictions make any military sense, and all of them have categorically said absolutely not. So we know this is purely political.
Yes, and similarly, when the Russian invasion began, full-scale invasion began in February 2022, many countries did not think Ukraine would survive. A few months later, the Ukrainians launched a counteroffensive and pushed the Russians out of central and northern Ukraine. They also defended Kyiv. And this showed many Western leaders that perhaps the Ukrainians are capable of defending themselves, and they started sending weapons. And over time, the Russian Federation has said that, as you stated, there are red lines that cannot be passed, such as sending long-range missiles or HIMARS or ATACMS, things along this nature. And as time has progressed, the Ukrainians have received these weapons, and in result, nothing has happened. The bluff on Russia has been called numerous times over the last 2.5 years, and I cannot understand why, if each time these supposed red lines are passed and there's no retaliation, well, why not give the Ukrainians the weapons that they need to defend themselves and win the war instead of unfortunately dragging on this conflict? Because the longer it takes to send the Ukrainians the weapons they need, as we discussed, the longer it gives. And this is what we saw in October of 2023 and April of 2024, is this gave the Russians almost 7 months in southern and eastern Ukraine an opportunity to fortify the occupied regions that they currently control, while the Ukrainians were running out of ammunition in these areas. They also needed to be more precise with their targets because as they were running out of ammunition, they were not in a situation to launch offensive. And unfortunately, because the Ukrainians were running out of ammunition and waiting on Western assistance, there was a false narrative in the Western media saying that the Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023 failed. Well, it's difficult to launch counteroffensives if you're limited on equipment and the capabilities to allow you to succeed. And as a result as well, the occupied territories in Ukraine in the east and the south are heavily mined, meaning that Ukrainian forces have to stop their tanks and other equipment, get off, demine the area before they're allowed to go through. And similarly, there are long scales of trenches that disrupt the ability for troops and equipment to move forward. So unfortunately, the longer it takes to send assistance, the longer this war will continue. It seems to be, as we've seen over the last 2.5 years.
And the NATO summit, whereas it made lots of positive noises about Ukraine and its sovereignty, etc., there's still no definition about what a victory would entail. Now, we know on the Ukrainian side essentially what that means. It means return of sovereign territories, including Crimea. It means reparations commensurate to the damage that's been inflicted, which is going to run to many, many, many billions at this point, if not hundreds of billions. And it is going to require certain security guarantees and a return of the sort of kidnapped citizens, including many children who are now located on the territory of Russia, as well as international support to get the displaced people returned. Obviously, there's the detail underlying that, but these are the broad kind of principles. At the moment, the Russian position on all of these is not clear, but is nowhere near approaching any one of these single demands. But on the Allies side, there is no really clear definition of this. What is NATO's definition, or is it purposefully left ambiguous at this point?
I think it's the latter. Something that Ukrainian citizens are very grateful for is continued Western support and assistance. And I think it's frankly remarkable that 2.5 years in, the majority of the globe continues to stand with Ukraine. There have been numerous referendums passed within the United Nations that continues to condemn Russia to this day with its war, even though NATO and the European Union have been the front runners for sending defense aid to Ukraine. There are numerous countries throughout Africa, Latin America, and Asia that are not sending defense equipment, but they're sending humanitarian assistance or medical assistance, which is equally as important. Of course, defensive weapons will help the Ukrainians reclaim territory, but other forms of assistance are needed to help civilians and the rest of the population. So I think that that is very important. And still to this day, the globe says that we will continue to stand with Ukraine. Unfortunately, that exact definition or statement is not clear. As we've stated, the Ukrainians state that the return of the 1991 borders is what has to be achieved in order for the war to end. And there are numerous polls that were recently conducted earlier this year by Democratic National Institute, International Republican Institute, that show that 80+% of Ukrainian citizens living in Ukraine want those demands met, which means the majority of the country still to this day, despite all the hardships and the atrocities that are occurring in their country, this is their end goal. And I don't understand why many countries around the world don't understand this. If these are people who are under brutal attacks, but this is the outcome that they want. So why can't the Western world help the Ukrainians achieve this? And of course, there are many nuances with Russian capabilities, and of course, there's still the fear of nuclear capabilities that Russia has as well. But there's still to this day, unfortunately, seems to be a disconnect between the Ukrainian officials and the NATO officials.
And if we look at NATO's core strategy developed during the Cold War on how to fight a potential Russian invasion of Europe, baked into that strategy was the idea that Russian forces numerically would be vastly superior in terms of the amount of armor, individual soldiers, etc., than the Western powers. Now, of course, the evidence that we've seen of Ukraine being ranked, I'm not sure where it was, but 20th in the world's rankings of military, and it's effectively destroyed the number 2 ranked military by quantity of armor and personnel. So first of all, that NATO doctrine completely out of date based on the evidence that we've seen. But secondly, the NATO doctrine is very much built on a sophisticated combined arms approach. Um, does the support provided by NATO completely disregard its own strategy and tactics? Because, of course, the air power that's been promised to Ukraine, we're more than 2 years in, and there's no sign of it yet.
I think NATO needs to decide on how it wants to continue assisting Ukraine. Of course, they have sent tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions, of defense equipment, medical equipment, humanitarian aid, financial aid, etc. And NATO officials need to come to an agreement on what does it mean and what needs to be done for Ukraine to achieve total victory. Because we are now running into a situation, the war has entered 2.5 years. Unfortunately, despite heavy international sanctions on the Russian Federation, President Putin and his government, and many Russian citizens who also support the war, do not seem interested in ending this anytime soon. So, unfortunately, it seems that the only way that this can be achieved is through force. And we've seen that that has been successful in some instances. For example, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, it took many Soviet casualties for them to leave Afghanistan, or similarly in Chechnya in the early 1990s, the Russians obtained some casualties from Chechen soldiers as well, which forced them out. And unfortunately, many lives have been lost, and human life is very precious and it cannot come back. And it seems like brute force and power are the only things that the Russian Federation understand in order for this war to end.
Another aspect, and this is one where perhaps some progress at last is being made, there seems to be some coordination on the provision of 155 millimeter artillery shells, of which an absolutely vast quantity are used in this conflict. I think the media, and it's very difficult even for someone like me who's interviewed so many people, it's very difficult to imagine the scale of what's going on and the sheer
Mhm.
quantity of munitions that are required daily. We know there was an ammunition famine, but we've also heard about the Czech initiatives. Is it the case that NATO behind the scenes has been playing a role in helping to sort of coordinate the global supply of ammunition, which is so important, but also replenishing stocks, firing up production lines? There is some evidence, at least, that this is starting to happen, and I would assume that NATO plays a key role in planning, prodding, organizing, and where finance is required, as well as prioritization of materials, including the source components that are required in these. There's a big role for NATO to play here.
Certainly, and it's time consuming and very, very costly. And right, this is not a video game where a few seconds you automatically emerge with a tank and if it gets destroyed, you can respawn within a matter of seconds. So this is something that NATO countries are looking into. Something that was discussed during the recent summit as well was the need to revamp the industrial base and looking at defense security and defense capabilities. But there's also some innovation that is occurring as well. For example, Czechia has been purchasing weapons and other forms of materials outside of the European Union and NATO, and they've been refurbishing this equipment itself because the equipment already exists. It doesn't have to be created. They refurbish the materials and they send it to Ukrainians, which occurs in a much quicker time span than trying to create and build something from scratch. I also know that there are many factories that are defunct in several NATO countries. Perhaps if they were to refurbish and rebuild these factories to build new weapons, it is helpful for not only Ukraine, but for themselves as well. They are able to then give stockpiles of their material and equipment to the Ukrainians, which can be used for the war. And in return, these NATO countries will be refurbishing and restocking with new weapons and latest state-of-the-art equipment to help with their own defense security. Similarly, by implementing these types of bases or factories that would allow NATO members to create these forms of assistance, this helps employ citizens and it helps boost the economies of these countries too. And I think while NATO has been helpful with Ukraine, NATO still does not understand that this is a wartime economy and situation rather than a time of peace. And as the Ukrainians have said several times, we don't need boots on the ground to come and help us defend. We just need equipment. But unfortunately, the longer this goes, perhaps President Putin will begin to think, oh, well, if I'm successful in Ukraine, I can dabble in the Eastern European countries such as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, who are part of NATO and the European Union, and try to push the envelope further. To that point as well, President Macron of France and the leaders of the three Baltic states and Poland have not ruled out sending military trainers or perhaps even troops to Ukraine. And unfortunately, that could potentially lead to further loss of life. So all the more reason for NATO to continue refurbishing and building what it can to help the Ukrainians succeed, because the last thing anyone wants is another large European full-scale war.
And that's interesting, isn't it? There's a couple of directions I want to, take this in. So I'm going to generate two questions, but I understand they're going to require separate answers. One is that we're seeing interesting moves by companies like Rheinmetall to invest actually in plants that can produce weapons and vehicles, from the ground up there, but also plants to or facilities to renovate damaged and older vehicles. So this is an interesting trend to actually build that capacity in Ukraine itself. That seems to circumvent some of the political roadblocks, and it means that actually you don't necessarily need permission for everything, but if you can find money, then actually Ukraine can do the core work. And that's a lesser problem than overcoming political barriers. The other one is deterrent power. Now, I know these are very, very different questions, but I'll just throw them out before I forget them. The other one, of course, is all this discussions about, will Ukraine, won't Ukraine become part of NATO, and what capacity and when does the war need to finish? To an extent, it's this ambiguity around NATO membership that has, I know this is a Russian talking point, it's a propaganda talking point that NATO is to blame, and this isn't the way I'm positioning it, but actually a clear and unambiguous accession to NATO several years back may have actually prevented this, is one of the speculations. And now again, the ambiguity about how will NATO become a member. There's been a statement that it will, but of course there's no time frame and there's no clear process to that accession. And it's not clear whether a country that actually has part of its territory in dispute could actually become part of NATO. Is this further ambiguity actually losing the deterrent power that being part of NATO actually has? And it's essentially neutering one of the tools in our armory to dissuade Russia from either escalation in this current war or starting a new one in future.
And we saw something similar, right? In 2008, the Russians invaded Georgia and still occupied northern parts of that country. Since the 1990s, there have been Russian troops in Transnistria and Moldova occupying that country too. And there is a clause in the NATO enlargement study that specifically states that countries cannot become members unless all territorial and land disputes are resolved. Now, unfortunately, for Ukraine and Georgia, it's not a territorial dispute. It was very clear that Russia invaded and is now occupying parts of those countries. But for some traditional NATO members, they will take that clause literally and prevent membership from being introduced to countries such as that. And we've seen that as well with neutrality in the state and role of NATO. Finland and Sweden are the two perfect examples where they were countries not members of NATO for several decades. And then when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine occurred, NATO and Finland quickly gathered together and submitted their applications, and they were accepted. So it seems, to your point, that there becomes some sort of shield and buffer for countries where protection is granted to NATO members, and unfortunately, those not part of NATO are subjected to aggression, perhaps not only from Russia, but other aggressive actors and dictators in the region. This is something that NATO members in Ukraine will have to see. Of course, throughout the war, the Ukrainians have shown time and time again that they are capable of using Western weaponry, and they are capable of adopting Western tactics, and they've been reforming their military since the first invasion in 2014. So I think from a defense security standpoint, I think the Ukrainians are capable. In addition, Ukrainian officials are also part of NATO Cyber Center in Estonia, and they've been subjected to Russian warfare through cyber means over the last 20 years, if not longer. So they not only are capable of showing and using Western equipment and technology, but they are also providing a service to NATO too. So it's a win-win for both organizations. Unfortunately, I think until the war is ended, full membership will not be introduced, and that's because there are many countries that are still roadblocking Ukrainian participation. And from their standpoints, it makes sense because there is the Article 5 clause, which says an attack on one is an attack on all, to paraphrase. And I think that those more traditional members of NATO are concerned that if Ukraine is granted full membership while the war is still occurring, that would then force all the other NATO countries to go into a war against Russia. But the war has also forced NATO to realize that in some cases it is outdated and there are things that have to be addressed. During this recent summit, NATO members also discussed the importance of reaching that 2% threshold for defense assistance. Many other countries recently pledged that they would reach that defense security requirement. I believe the number is now 20 of the 32 members are looking to achieve that, which is very significant because a few years ago it was only 5 of then 30 members of NATO were achieving that defense spending. And this is important because it is forcing NATO members to refocus on what is national defense strategy, what is national security, how do they look at their industrial base, and they are now exploring other ways, as you mentioned, about creating weapons and using these bases and factories to create weapons in a more efficient and effective manner because technology is constantly evolving every day. And NATO members, I believe, are also exploring ways in which they can share technology with one another. So that, for example, if one country is very good at building ammunition for various tanks, and then one country is good at using equipment to construct tanks, it lessens burdens of all the countries working on everything together and trying to slowly build the puzzle together where they're taking advantages of their strong suits, and those who are weaker in certain areas can collaborate with their NATO partners and work more efficiently on the matter.
And that's incredibly sort of positive, but we're faced with another challenge here, which is that as Russia demonstrably doesn't make progress on the battlefield and it has its own economic woes, it has other, let's say, arrows in its quiver, and one of those is hybrid warfare. And we're seeing an uptick in potential assassinations. I say potential because these may be going on and they may not yet be proven, or other plots, as we've seen with Rheinmetall recently, have been foiled. But we've got sabotage, we've got assassination, we've got all sorts of hybrid threats where, they don't go for a full invasion, but they start to up the stakes, whether it's sort of aircraft, buzzing territory, removing marker buoys around Narva, which is one of the provocations recently. It's a provocation, assassination, sabotage. These are going to be growing threats, and cyber as well. And there's no proof that the recent IT outage was triggered by an attack, but it's perfectly conceivable that something like the global chaos we saw on Friday could, be done again, and as the result of a malicious actor. So again, what's the role of individual states? What's the role of NATO in guarding against this?
I think the recent situation that occurred just on Friday shows how dependent the world is on technology and the ability to connect with one another. And that is very important because if a individual or an aggressive actor is working, they can effectively shut down banks, they can shut down refrigerators, so making it difficult for people to eat. They can shut down airports. We're making it unsafe for citizens to travel. And cyber, I think, as it evolves, and many individuals and corporations are requiring heavily on technology, that could be a new realm. Unfortunately, NATO has a cyber defense center where they are exploring and examining these matters every day.
And another area, of course, and this is probably the sort of last area we'll have sort of time to discuss here, we are seeing an extraordinary evolution of warfare, including drone warfare. So at the start, maybe even now, there's these conversations of what Ukraine can learn from NATO, and there's been quite a bit of that going on, including training Ukrainian troops, both in country and abroad. And that's not to diminish that. There's some incredibly important things going on there, especially when you draft huge numbers of civilians who've not necessarily, served in a military capacity. However, it seems that Ukraine has an extraordinary conjunction here of technological innovation, civic society activism, and very rapid testing at the front, which creates an extraordinarily say unprecedented loop of feedback, information, and innovation, not just in technology, but in tactics and deployment, as well as the training that then takes place for these techniques across the front. And we must assume some of this is going on the Russian side as well, albeit not with such a free exchange of information. How should NATO members, and indeed NATO, be monitoring this and learning from the innovations that are taking place in Ukraine?
Something that Ukraine has done very well is the usage of drones. So when there were several restrictions and Ukrainian officials and the government was not allowed to receive long-range missiles, the Ukrainians were very innovative and started to discover and toy with how can we use drones to attack Russian warships and other capabilities on the Black Sea or in deep within Russian occupied territories or even the Russian Federation itself. And that also has helped limit lives, the loss of life, because if a drone is destroyed, then unfortunately the drone is lost and they will rebuild. But human life is precious, and once a citizen or a volunteer fighting in Ukraine is lost, that life cannot come back. So the Ukrainians have been exploring how to use these drones to limit casualties on their front. And also, they've been, as we said, they've been very innovative. Ukrainian citizens have been reconstructing their garages to help construct materials for the Ukrainian military to use them, such as drones or bombs. Similarly, various factories within Ukraine have been refurbished to help create body armor for Ukrainians or weapons for the Ukrainians, etc. So perhaps NATO officials can work with the Ukrainians more closely and interact with them to see how are they using this innovation and this creativity to push the barriers and go beyond the normal capabilities and usage of certain types of equipment and using it to be a lot more productive in their military capabilities and capacity.
General Zaluzhny has put a big emphasis on innovation as a key strategy to win the war, as well as obviously the industrial scale that is required to then support that. But innovation and scale are two of the big topics. I mean, this is the last question here. How important is it that Zaluzhny, who is so eloquent and I would say insightful, and of course, very highly regarded almost universally in Ukraine, especially in the armed forces, how important is it that he is now ambassador to the UK? And one must assume that UK being an important member of NATO, that ideally, this would facilitate conversations around what Western allies and NATO need to do to align with this concept of victory in Ukraine, not just what victory is, but how it is to be achieved.
The United Kingdom has been more responsive and receptive for the Ukrainians to use equipment in the manner that they need to help defend themselves, whereas NATO members such as the United States or Germany or France have been more reserved and constricting the Ukrainians on what to use. So perhaps as now ambassador to the United Kingdom, former General Zaluzhny can work more closely with the newly elected Labour government, which also stated that they will be sending 3.5 billion pounds in defense assistance and helping the Ukrainians how they can, and creating a new, stronger partnership. And perhaps as this relationship develops, other NATO countries that are a bit more reserved with Ukrainian defense assistance will see, well, the Brits and the Ukrainians are working together, and these are the achievements and outcomes that they are receiving, perhaps lifting further restrictions on defense assistance and ability to target Russian military areas will dissolve over time.
Well, Mark, it's been a huge pleasure speaking to you again, and we should do it more frequently, I think, than once every 12 months. But these are crucial insights in the follow-up to the NATO summit that recently took place. Thank you so much for coming on the channel again and for sharing these with the audience.
Thank you again for having me, and hopefully there will be continued dialogue and construction within NATO and Ukraine to help for a Ukrainian victory.